lighting a candle for Magdalena. Winston had to be careful. He couldn't book the same place in a resort 2 years in a row. No, he had to mix it up. It would have been better if he could have changed venues completely. But he was a creature of habit. He didn't like the challenge of something new. So, every year, he took his holiday in the same place, but at a different villa. Like the women in this village, the villas all looked the same. The villa he was viewing now looked familiar, but it was the only one available. He'd take the risk. Winston wasn't rich by any stretch of the imagination, but he had plenty of cash on the hip. He was 32 years old, single, and lived in the house he inherited when his parents died. The house he was born in. It was all bought and paid for. He only had rates, utilities, and insurance to cough up every month. That left him plenty of spare cash from his job as a van driver. So, once a year, he could splash out and spoil himself. He was not a popular man, and not by choice. He would have loved to have friends, a gang of mates to share a joke with. He would have loved to have a bunch of pals to get pissed and go to that little bit too far with. But his behavior was not normal. Even the basest of thugs would think the things Winston got up to were wicked. In truth, he was certifiable. But he wasn't stupid. He kept his darker side well hidden when at home. But alone and on holiday, anything goes. It's got 2 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, TV, Wi-Fi, the lot, and it's serviced every day, said Andreas, the Via rental rep. What do you mean serviced? You get your bathroom and kitchen cleaned. A change of sheets, that sort of thing. He shrugged. It's included in the price. How much? Asked Winston. $800, and that includes all your utilities and a welcome pack. What's a welcome pack? It's to get you started for the week. Tea, coffee, bottled water, that kind of stuff. A pile of shit then, said Winston. If you like, said the rep. Andreas had dealt with hundreds of men like Winston in his time. Thugs with too much money and no friends. People that hid away from normal people. Winston paid in euros, cash in hand. The rep gave him the keys and left. Glad to see the back of that creepy fuck. It was 8 o'clock at night. Winston had wandered into the rental office just before it closed and asked if there were any last-minute villas available. That's how he liked to do it. No internet, no paper trail, a cash transaction. The rep had driven him to the villa, and the cash had been handed over, all nice and clean. The villa was located on the edge of a large village, not quite big enough to call itself a town. The villa was only a short walk to the few clubs and bars at the village center. Perfect. Winston was an attractive man. He was neither handsome nor charming, but he was a bull. He stood over 6 feet and weighed nearly 18 stone, mostly muscle. He was bald and had a bullet-shaped head. His skin was pockmarked from teenage acne. He had piggy eyes, small, red-rimmed, and nearly black. Some women were attracted to ugly men like him. They felt safe, protected. So he normally didn't have much trouble picking up some poor, desperate sort in a bar. Typically his target female would be on her own, like him, either friendless or in the midst of some personal crisis. The poor woman would be desperate for company. Anybody's. Even his. The best targets would be pissed and full of their own misery, bleating about their troubles and how they'd be better off dead. He'd help them along. It was as if he was doing them a favor. He would put them out of their misery. Cleaning up afterwards was awkward. But he had a routine. He'd hire a car for a day, take the body to the other end of the island late at night, and dump it off a cliff into the sea. It was a tried and tested method, and worked for him for 5 years in a row. He loved the women on this part of the island. They were curvy and full-figured, not like the skinny women that hung around the bars in the main resorts. The women from this area all had similar features, symmetrical faces, dark eyes, and long curly treacle-colored hair. There were so many of them. It was a very Catholic part of the island. Big families, plenty of choices. Winston unpacked his case. He laid out his clothes and selected the attire he would use for going on the pool that evening. It would be smart, but not flamboyant. He wanted to come across as attractively dressed, but not too showy. He didn't want to stand out too much. He didn't want to be remembered too easily by others in the bar. By the time he finished getting ready, it was 10 o'clock in the evening. He took a fistful of notes from his wallet and stuffed them into his back pocket before checking his appearance in the mirror. He was pleased with the result. He was dressed to kill. The doorbell rang just as he was putting on his coat. This came as a surprise to Winston. He didn't know that the VA even had a doorbell. He answered the door to a young woman in her early 20s, dressed in jeans and a white blouse, over which was a blue tabard. She had a bucket and mop and other cleaning materials held to her side. She was an absolute stunner. All raven black hair, olive dark, perfect skin, and beautiful symmetrical facial features. Her body was to die for. She reminded him of the last but one he did. She had been from this part of the island. He smiled inwardly at the pleasure of the memory. "It's Friday," she said. "I'm here to service the villa." "I've only just arrived," said Winston. "Everything's clean." "I still have to check," brushing him aside as she walked in. "Tomorrow the villa will not be serviced." "Why not?" "It's a big holiday," she said, putting her cleaning kit down on the kitchen floor. "So I have to suffer while you sun yourself?" he said. "No, it's not like that. It's All Saints celebration. A very sad day," she said. Turning to face him, she added, "We will not be happy. We remember our ancestors and those we have lost, and we pray." Winston looked the cleaner up and down. Yes, she was tasty, sweet body, and very pretty. But she was not for him. Someone would know where she was. He watched her check the kitchen, opening and closing the cupboards, checking the oven, cooker, and other appliances, and then checking the floor was clean. When she'd finished, she said, "I check the bathroom and bedroom now, then I go." While she was busy, Winston took out the bottle of scotch he had bought on the plane and poured himself a drink. He sat at the kitchen table waiting for her to finish. After a few minutes, the woman came back into the kitchen. "It's all okay. I come back Sunday." "Have a drink with me," he said. "No, thank you. I need to go. I need to prepare for tomorrow." "Tell me about this All Saints thing," he said, as he poured her a large whiskey. He pushed it across the kitchen table in her direction. She looked at the drink, then at Winston. After considering the situation for a moment, she pulled out a chair and sat down opposite of him. "Okay," she said. She picked up the glass and clinked it to his, and then took a sip. "All Saints is when we remember our dead," she said. "Those in our family that have left us. We also light a candle in the church to our patron saint. Each islander has a patron saint that takes care of them. When you were born, the priest will decide who that will be. Mine is Magdalena. I have to light a candle in the village church to her before midnight. If I do this, all my sins will be absolved." "Why bother? It's all mumbo-jumbo." She suddenly turned deadly serious. She looked him straight in the eye as she spoke. "Oh no," she said. "If you don't have your sins absolved, the dead will seek you out," she said. "There are many lost souls on this island. They have been sinned against and need to be avenged. If you don't light a candle to your patron saint before midnight, they will come for you. I promise. They will steal your soul." There was an intensity in the way the woman spoke to him that sent a shiver down Winston's spine. She meant business. It was a new experience for Winston. He had never felt the shudder of fear, and he didn't like it. The woman pushed back her chair and stood up. "I go now," she said, collecting her paraphernalia. At the door, she turned around and looked back at him. "Forgive me for saying," she said, "but you look like a man with many sins. Magdalena will protect you. Light a candle in the church before midnight." The woman closed the door behind her, and Winston was left alone to his thoughts. Fucking primitives, he said quietly to himself before downing his drink and what was left of the cleaner's glass. He stood up and walked over to the window. It was pitch dark outside. The property had large floor-to-ceiling sliding glass doors, overlooking a garden surrounded by a high hedge. He heard a car drive away, but couldn't see its lights through the hedge. He walked to the front door. To the right of it, mounted halfway down the wall, was a switch. He flicked it on, and the porch lit up the terrace that ran the length of the front of the villa. It flickered for a few moments, then went out. Winston switched it off and on again. The light stayed on. Shit electrics, he said. 800 euros and the fucking lights don't work. He stepped over to the table and poured himself another drink, a sharpener before going out on the hunt. He picked up the glass and turned towards the window. He downed it with one gulp. The light on the veranda started to flash on and off again. It was as if he was looking at lightning. Suddenly, the light failed completely. The veranda was in complete darkness. Fucking lights, he cursed. Moments later, the light began to flicker on again. Then, as before, it went out. But this time it was very different. Winston dropped his glass. It shattered on the hard tiled floor. His heart was suddenly racing so fast he thought he was going to have a heart attack. For in the brief moment the veranda was illuminated by the flashing light, he had seen the figure of a woman, a young woman. She had been standing at the edge of the veranda, in perfect stillness, looking through the window, staring in at him. She was covered in a white veil from head to foot. When the light had come back on, she had gone, disappeared completely. The veranda was now just as it had been. He ran to the door and threw it open. In seconds he was out on the veranda, his heart pounding, half afraid of what he might find, half in determined rage to catch the locals playing a trick on him. But there was no one there. What the fuck? As he stomped back into the villa and slammed the door behind him. He needed another drink. Winston's nocturnal prowl was a dead loss. There wasn't a club open, and only one bar that had only one other customer. An old peasant type dozing in a corner. He thought at least he might be able to salvage the evening by interrogating the bartender about the nightlife and where to find available women. But as soon as the bartender had clapped eyes on Winston, he had wisely decided he couldn't speak any English. The man had been around the block a few times. He knew a weirdo when he saw one. Winston sneaked out of the bar at 11 o'clock. He had enough. He would have had a good night's sleep and go on the prowl again tomorrow night. The village had very few streetlights, apart from the main street through the village and a couple of roads leading away from the center. It was mostly narrow, cobbled alleys. Those lights that had been fitted were mounted low on the walls and cast eerie, long shadows. Still, it was a warm, balmy evening. Winston was quite enjoying his walk back to the villa when he suddenly heard a woman's voice. In the still silence of the night, it had come out of nowhere. Only one word was spoken, but it sent a little chill down his spine. Mariana. The voice echoed down the narrow alley. He stopped and looked around. He turned a full circle. There was nobody there. He thought for a moment. Mariana? He recognized the name. Something stirred in his memory. He set off again, but hadn't traveled more than 10 yards before it hit him like a blow to the stomach. Mariana was the name of the woman he'd picked up in a bar in this very village 2 years ago. She was one of his. He quickened his pace, his lone footsteps echoing off the narrow walls. The memory of Mariana returned as he hurried toward his villa. She had been alone and drunk, drowning her sorrows after a squabble with her family. She had wanted to go to the university, but her brothers wouldn't let her. She wanted to break free of the claustrophobic life of a large extended family and the limited confines of the village. She had wanted to see the world. He'd made sure she never would. Winston turned a corner into the alley that led to his villa. What he saw in the half-light stopped him dead in his tracks. His heart nearly leaped out of his chest. Standing under the wall-mounted light, at the end of the alley, was a ghostly figure. It took the form of a woman. It seemed to shimmer, radiating a weak, sleekly green glow. The apparition was wearing a long veil covering its head and trailing onto the ground. It was perfectly still. Winston stood transfixed. He couldn't take his eyes off it. Mariana! This time the voice came from behind him. It was nearer. Again, a young woman's voice. He spun around, but the alley behind him was empty. He turned back in the direction of the spectral figure, but it had gone. Mariana! He spun around again. There was the apparition, this time at the opposite entrance to the alley. It was moving towards him, slowly, its shimmering green light making it appear ghoulish. Mariana! The sound came from behind him again. He twisted his neck in the direction of the voice. There, now halfway down the alley, and heading directly towards him, was the same ghastly shade. Somehow, it managed to appear in two places at once. He ran, not towards either of the two ghostly entities, but up a narrow tumble-down pathway just to his right. It was almost pitch dark, and he had no idea where it would lead, but he ran as if the devil himself was chasing him. What the fuck? While looking for a place to hide. Don't try anything! I'll knock all your teeth out! He emerged seconds later, gasping for breath, to taste the blood stinging the back of his throat. He found himself in a cob square with no road leading away from it, just a series of narrow alleyways, like the one he had just escaped through. He had never been to this place before, although he'd visited the village regularly for years. A couple of streetlights lit up the square, which made him feel safer. The plaza consisted of tall, adobe-side buildings surrounding the small church standing alone in its center. Mariana! The voice came from the alley he had just left. It sounded mere yards away. He sprinted across the square and headed towards one of the alleys. He never reached it. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the shimmering green light forming from deep within the alley shadows. He turned around looking for an alternative bolt hole. A wave of ice-cold fear broke over him. There, in the middle of the cobbed square, was the figure of the veiled woman. It was facing him, standing perfectly still. Who are you? As he slowly backed away. Then from close behind, a voice said, Mariana. He ran with all the speed he could muster up the steps of the church, pushed open the door, and slammed it behind him. He pressed his back hard against it while he looked around and took in his surroundings. The church was empty. It was poorly lit by just a few small candles surrounding a small shrine near the altar. His eyes adjusted to the gloom and were drawn towards the shrine. He walked over. It consisted of an effigy of crouching women at prayer, set on a small plinth. A trestle table had been set up in the front of it. On this, a dozen candles flickered. Upon closer inspection, the effigy appeared to be more like a tailor's mannequin than a religious figurine. It seemed incongruous, not part of the permanence of the other religious artifacts in the small church. A handwritten banner had been strung out behind it. It read, Santa Magdalena, protegeis eles gangaikot. The whole thing looked slicked together by amateurs in a rush, but Winston couldn't tear his eyes off it. He stared transfixed at the shrine. The cleaning woman had talked about it. She'd said something about lighting a candle to have your sins absolved. He'd only been half listening. It means to protect those that have fallen. Again, it had come from nowhere. A man's voice this time. It scared the life out of him. To his relief, a priest stepped out of the shadows from behind the altar and started walking towards him. Hearing the sudden voice of the priest was both a shock and a relief. He buckled slightly at the knees, but managed to regain control before the priest reached him. I could see you're looking at the shrine. It is only temporary, set up by some of the villagers just for All Saints' Day. Can I help you? No, I'm all right, lied Winston. You don't look it, said the priest. Have you something on your mind? Are you Catholic? No, Winston said. I just wanted to see the inside of the church. That's all. The priest eyed Winston. He could tell when a man was lying to him. If you do need me, I'll be just the other side of that door. He pointed at a dark portal to the right of the altar, then walked over and went through, closing the door behind him. Winston was once again alone. He stepped over to the shrine. Unlit candles were laid in a small pile on a corner of the trestle table. Winston felt both stupid and frightened as he picked one. Fucking stupid mumbo-jumbo. There's no such thing as ghosts, he whispered to himself, half to reassure himself that he didn't believe what had happened to him that evening was ever real or fake. He looked around furtively before lighting the candle from one of those already burning. It was as he was putting the burning candle into the holder that Winston experienced the biggest fright of his life. It nearly stopped his heart. The effigy moved. It turned its head from a silent prayer and moved its face towards his. The movement alone was nearly enough to send Winston over the edge, but it was what the effigy did next that caused him to run screaming from the church. As the effigy's face moved closer to his, it hissed. "Magdalena! Help me!" Winston bolted towards the church doors in terror. He threw back the doors with a mighty heave, only to be frozen in his tracks. Barring his exit just outside the church door was the apparition. At the time it was moving slowly forward, its arms held outstretched, fingers clutching like claws at his eyes. It hissed at him as it approached. "Magdalena! No! Go away! I didn't mean to do it!" Winston turned and ran for his life back into the church. Screaming in fear, he ran to the door beside the altar. As he ran, he caught the briefest glimpse of the shrine. The effigy was gone. He reached the door, grabbed the handle and twisted, but it did not open. It was locked. He wrung the handle frantically, as hard as he could, but it would not budge. He beat on the door with his fist for all he was worth. "Save me!" he screamed. "I killed her, so they're coming for me! They want my soul!" He pounded until his fist bled. He glanced over his shoulder in panic. There was the apparition. It was still, moving slowly towards him, arms outstretched, drawing nearer and nearer. His heart was thumping as the adrenaline rush bone of sheer terror pumped through his veins. He pressed his face hard into the door and screamed as if the devil himself was clawing at his soul. He felt the apparition touch him on the back of his head. A tremor of sheer horror ran through his body. Suddenly the door opened. Salvation! Winston fell through the door and tumbled onto the floor inside. Kicking the door closed behind him with all his might, he lay there panting, clutching at his chest. His eyes locked onto the door for fear it might open, or worse, that the apparition could pass straight through. Nothing happened. He lay there on the floor in terror, eyes fixed on the door, but still nothing happened. His heart rate gradually started to drop back to normal. He started to feel safe. He slowly stood up and looked around the room for the first time. There was the priest. He was sitting behind a long table in the middle of the chamber. Winston's heart sank. The priest was not alone. 2 burly men were sitting either side of him, each one wearing a policeman's uniform. But the shock of seeing the 2 policemen was nothing compared to the next thing he saw. Standing in the shadows at the far side of the chamber was the effigy of Santa Magdalena. It was leaning against the wall. It was smoking a cigarette. The veil had removed. He recognized the woman straight away. It was the cleaner from the villa. "Take this bastard away," she said. The policeman stood and slowly walked towards Winston, now slumped on the floor, weeping like a baby. After the 2 policemen had bundled Winston out of the church and into the back of the car, the priest sat in the church talking to Mariana's 3 sisters. The women were each removing their costumes. 2 were dressed as apparitions, the veils still glowing green from the luminous paint. The other was dressed as Santa Magdalena. "You know I don't approve of what you did," said the priest. "What else could we do?" said the cleaning woman. "The law did nothing. As soon as Andres told us it was the same man renting the villa, we had to act." "But the law will serve you now. The man has confessed in front of witnesses," said the priest. The cleaning woman gave a half-laugh. "What?" asked the priest. "My cousins aren't taking him to the police station," she said. "They're taking him to the cliff, the one where he got rid of her body." "Mother of God!" gasped the priest. "It's better this way," said the woman coldly. "It's natural justice. God's way." The priest sighed, then shook his head slowly. He looked at his watch. "It's 3 minutes till 12, said the priest. "You had each better light a candle."